In this series, I'm documenting my journey creating a Real World Quasar Framework app, Fudget 2, from scratch, an app that will ultimately be deployed to the iOS, Android, Mac and Windows app stores. And in this video, I'll be covering the layout, global components, this custom Pane component that I've created, and also how I've set up state management using the Composition API. Make sure you subscribe and click the bell if you don't want to miss any of the videos in this series, and check out the link to the whole playlist in the description. So this week I've started working on the app and I've created a new Quasar version 2 project, which is still in beta at the time I'm recording this. And I've set up a basic layout which is adapting nicely across desktop and mobile. And I've set up the 4 main pages: budgets, starred, settings and account. Although there's not much going on these pages at the moment. I've created this custom reusable Pane component, which you can see 2 of them here, and each one of these Pane components has its own header, its own footer and a scrollable content area. So you can see these scroll areas are independently scrollable. And I've also set up some basic state management for the app using the Composition API. So I've got the basic layout working for both desktop and mobile. You can see the difference there. And on desktop, I have the navigation items over on the left in a QDraw component. Although it's not a toggleable QDraw, it's just always visible. And I've also set up pages and routes for all the different pages: the budgets page, the starred page, the settings page, and the account page. Although there's not much going on these pages at the moment. And I also have this nice gradient background that you can see in the background, which is kind of an angled gradient, which starts with this darker orange and then ends in a lighter orange down here. And all I'm doing here, and I'll just jump to my CSS folder and themes.scss. This is the themes.scss file, which I talked about a lot in the last video. And if I just jump to this bit here, basically all I'm doing is spitting out a class called background-desktop. And I'm just simply taking the primary color from the current theme and setting up a linear gradient with a -47 degrees angle. And then I'm just taking the primary color from the current theme and lightening it a little bit for the start color and then darkening it a little bit for the end color by just using the lighten and darken methods, which come with Sass and SCSS. And then I'm just adding this class to the body tag. So this gradient is actually being applied on the body tag. And so I don't currently have a means to change the theme within the app. But if I just jump to the inspector here and the body tag, I have this data-theme attribute, which is set to orange, which means it's currently using this orange theme. But if I change this to blue, then we can see this gradient change, except it's now using the primary blue color from this theme to create the darker and lighter versions of the primary color instead of the orange. And to make this gradient completely visible, I did need to make the QDraw component transparent, because if I jump to CSS and this drawer.scss, you can see I've set the QDraw to background transparent there. And if I comment that out, you can see the drawer now has a white background by default. So I had to make that transparent so that we can see all of this gradient on the body tag. And by the way, I'm also keeping all of my SCSS for this project in these SCSS files in the CSS folder. And I'm not going to be putting any CSS in the component files themselves, because personally I find it a little bit clunky having to dig through different component files, trying to find where I've set the styles and trying to change those styles. So I'd rather just keep all the CSS in one place and just split it up into meaningful files. But really that's just a personal preference. And on each page in the app, I'm displaying these Pane components. And on desktop, we can display 2 of these Pane components at once. Whereas on mobile, we only ever display 1 pane at a time. Although on mobile, we can load in other panes over the top of the current pane like this, which kind of gives the effect of loading a new page in the app. And so each of these panes, and I'll go into more detail about these panes in the next chapter. So each of these panes has its own header component, its own footer component, which is always at the bottom, and its own body component or content area, which is independently scrollable. So ultimately, I'll be displaying a list of budgets in the left pane here, such as March, April, May. And then when the user clicks on one of those budgets, we'll load that budget into this pane and display all of the income and expense entries in this pane, a bit like you can see in the design here. Now on mobile, I'm only ever going to show one pane at once. So if I scale this down, you can see we just see one pane on this budgets page. But ultimately, when the user taps on a budget name, it will load in the other pane like this. So this way we can get this to work nicely on both desktop and mobile. And you can see on mobile, I'm also displaying the navigation items in a footer, a queue footer component, using a queue tabs component. And again, we can jump through all of the pages using that footer navigation on mobile. And I'm storing all of these nav items and icons in an array and using that array to spit these out. So if I just jump to layouts and main layout.view and jump to my setup function. So I have this array of nav links here, which has the title for the link, the icon we want to use, and the link that it should go to. And I'm just using a v-for loop to spit out the navigation items using this array in the queue drawer for desktop and the queue footer for mobile. So one of the big issues with the layout of this app was that I sometimes wanted to display more than one page on the screen at once on desktop, whereas I only ever wanted to display one page on the screen on mobile. So I couldn't just use normal pages for these pages that you see here. And so to solve this problem, I created a custom and reusable pane component. So if I just jump to components and global and this pane folder, we have a pane.view component, which is the main pane component. And we also have a pane header for this header that you see up here, a pane footer for the footer you see at the bottom, and a pane body component for this scrollable area. And if I just jump to the main pane.view component, I've also set up some props here, left, right, and full width, for making a pane appear on the left like this one, or on the right like this one, or create a full width pane like this one, which you can see on the other pages. And these props are just going to add a CSS class to the pane, such as pane desktop left, pane desktop right, pane desktop full width. And then I'm just using CSS to style these and position them. So a full width pane like this will just fill all of the width that's available. So if I scale this down, you can see it always takes up all of the available width. A left pane is always positioned on the left and has a fixed width. So you can see as I scale this, the left pane doesn't change width, and then a right pane will always be positioned next to the left pane and will always fill all of the width that's left over. So you can see as I scale it up, this right hand pane will also scale up and take up all of the width that's available to it. So I'll try and explain the CSS for this. So I'm going to jump to CSS and pane.scss. So I'm using two variables here. Pane margin, which is set to 30 pixels, which is just the amount of space that we have around a pane at the top, right, bottom, and left. And that's also the amount of space between each pane as well when we show more than one. And this second variable, pane left width, is just setting the width for a pane that's on the left like this. So this pane here is 367 pixels wide. So in order to position these properly, I've added a class of relative position to each queue page component. So if I jump to one of my pages, say page budgets, I have a class of relative position on the queue page so that I have more control over how these panes are positioned. Then if I jump back to pane.scss, so on the main pane element, I have a media query here, which is only going to fire on desktop displays. So all of these styles here are just for desktop. We're just adding a bit of border radius to give these panes a nice rounded edge on desktop. We're setting the margin to this pane margin variable. So we always have 30 pixels of margin around each pane. And then importantly, we're setting the position to absolute. And then to set the height of the pane, I'm using the calc method and setting the height to 100%. So 100% of its parent component, which is a queue page component, minus the pane margin multiplied by 2. So this way, even if we resize the height of the browser or the app, the pane will always take up the whole height of the app minus the top and bottom margin that we need. So you can see the height scales up and down nicely on different displays. And this pane desktop left class is only for panes which are on the left, like this one here. And these classes are being added by those props that I mentioned before. And so this pane desktop left class is just going to set the width to this variable up here, pane left width. So this left pane will always be 367 pixels wide. And we don't need to set the position of this pane because these panes are absolutely positioned. So by default, the pane will be displayed at the top left point of the parent container, the QPage component anyway. And this pane desktop right class, which you see here, is only for right panes like this one here. And to position this in the right place, I'm setting the left property to the width of the left pane, which is in this variable, plus the pane margin variable, which is 30 pixels, which will always place this right-hand pane exactly 30 pixels to the right of this left pane. So even if I decide to change the default width of the left pane by changing this variable here, so I'll set it to 400 pixels, you can see the right pane is still 30 pixels to the right of the left pane. And I'll just set that back to what it was. And to set the width of this right pane and make sure it always scales up and fills up all of the available width that's left after the left pane, I'm again using the calc method and setting it to 100%. So 100% of the parent component, which is the QPage component, minus the width of the left pane, which is in this variable, minus the value that's in this pane margin variable times 3. So basically I'm setting the width of this pane to 100% of the parent component minus this margin that's to the left of the left pane, minus the width of the left pane, and minus this bit of margin between the two panes, and minus this margin that's at the end. So this way the right hand pane always scales up and down to fill the space that's available. And so all of the styles in this media query are just for desktop and they'll be ignored on mobile. But for mobile, I have this mobile-off-screen class, which can be added to a pane to position it off the screen to the right. So if I scale this down, right now that right-hand pane, which is now disappeared, it currently has this mobile off-screen class on it and it's positioned off the screen over to the right. And if I click this button, that class will be removed from the right pane and we'll see the right pane slide into view, almost like a new page loaded. So I have 4 custom components for these panes. If I go to components and global and pane, so we have pane.view, which is the main pane component. And then we have the pane header component, the pane body component, and the pane footer component. So if I jump to this pane header.view component, so we don't actually have a Q header component in here like you might expect, because Q headers are fixed elements by default and they're always fixed in position right at the top of the view. So what I've actually done here is grab the underlying markup of a Q header component using the inspector on a different Quasar app and pasted it in here. And then I've just removed any classes which were causing it to be fixed, so that we get all of the same styles of a Q header, except we can now control the position of it and make it absolute by adding a class such as absolute to it. And I also have some slots in this pane header component. So I have a slot here for placing buttons on the left and a slot here for the title and another slot here for buttons on the right, because different headers in these panes throughout the app are going to have different titles and different buttons on the right and the left. So this way, whenever I'm using one of these pane components, I can easily insert different titles and buttons for each of these pane headers. Okay, so I'll jump to this pane body component, which is this scrollable content area. And this component is basically just a Q scroll area with this fit class added to it, giving it 100% width and height. And by default, this Q scroll area was being placed right behind the pane header and the pane footer because it was 100% height of the pane component. And so to nudge this Q scroll area down at the top and to nudge it up at the bottom, I've added these spacer divs. So a spacer for the header and a spacer for the footer. And I've just set the height on these to the height of the header and the footer. And at some point, I'm probably going to have to make these height styles dynamic because some footers are going to be taller than other footers in the app. So that's going to be an interesting challenge, figuring out how I'm going to dynamically set the height on these spacers. And then we just have another div in the middle here for placing the content, and we have a slot there so that we can easily inject different content into different panes. Finally, this pane footer component is basically just a div absolutely positioned to the bottom of the pane with the absolute bottom class. And then we just have a slot here so that we can easily stick different buttons and different components into different footers in different panes throughout the app. So I'll show you a component that's using these pane components so you can see how they get used in action. So I'll jump to components and budgets.vue, and that's this pane that you see here on the left. So I'm just adding a left prop to this pane to position it on the left. Then we have a pane header component, and you can see I'm sending the title to it with this vslot template, which is this title here, budgets. And then I'm sending this button here to the buttons right slot. And then after the pane header, we have the pane body component, and the pane body component just has one default slot. And for now, I'm just sticking a div with a bit of padding and some dummy content, basically just a load of paragraphs and just a button as well for demonstrating the different panes on mobile, this button here. And then after the pane body component, we have the pane footer component, where in this case, I'm just spitting out a div with a bit of padding and then a button, this add budget button, which isn't doing anything right now. Since these pane components are going to be used on every page of the app, I thought it made sense to make these global components rather than having to import them and register them everywhere. So you can see on this budgets.vue where I'm using all of these pane components, I'm not actually importing these components or registering them because these components are all available globally. And I did this by creating a boot file. So if I go to the boot folder, I have this global-components.js boot file. And I have this object here, and each property in this object is just the HTML element name for the component, and the value is just set to the require statement needed to grab that component. And then I'm basically just looping through each item in this object and adding the component to the root app instance by using the app.component method. And so now these components are available everywhere within the app, and I don't need to import them anywhere or require them. And in the future, if I need to make more components global, then all I need to do is add them to this object and I'm good to go. So this is a nice little trick that I found on Stack Overflow. I've also set up the basis for the state management for this app as well using the composition API. A bit like I did in my composition API state management video, which you might want to check out. Although in this case, we also have the option for multiple store modules. So I've created this store folder, and in there I have this index.js file. And this is just returning an object called store. And this is also pulling in this entries object, which you could think of as a store module. And eventually I'll have a bunch of store modules here. So one for budgets, one for settings, one for authentication, etc. But right now I'm just importing this one store module for managing the entries pane, which is this pane over on the right here. And if we open that up in this entries folder, so entries and then store-entries.js. So right now in this store module, we just have a state object, which is a reactive object. So I don't have any actions or getters at the moment, but later on there will be an actions object and a getters object as well here. But right now we just have this reactive state object with just one property in it, this show pane entries property, which is being used to determine whether entries pane is shown or not on mobile like this. And to make this store object and all of its store modules available everywhere within the app, I've created another boot file. So if I jump to the boot folder, I have this store.js file where I'm just importing that store object from this file in the store folder. And then I'm just using the app.provide method to provide this object to the entire app. And then to use the store within a component, all I need to do is I'll just open this budgets.vue component and scroll down. So all I need to do is inject this store object in my setup function and return it. and I can then access the store in this component. So you can see here on this button, I have this click handler. So all I need to do to access the state in this entries store module is just fire store.entries.state and then the name of the property, and I can then change it. And so later on, when I add actions and getters to this store entries store module, I'll be able to access them at just store.entries.actions and store.entries.getters. And then when I create more store modules, such as a settings store module, I'll be adding that to this main store object, and I'll be able to access that store module at store.settings.state or .actions or .getters. And I may replace this composition API state management system with Vuex5 when that comes out, because that's going to get rid of mutations and just have asynchronous actions, which can also mutate the state. And so I may replace this with Vuex5 when that comes out, if I feel like I'm missing out on the debugging capabilities and stuff like that of Vuex. Let me know in the comments if you would do any of this stuff differently, or if you have any questions about any of this stuff. Check out the full playlist in the description. Please hover over my face over there and click subscribe so you don't miss any of the videos in this series. And every subscription helps me to create more content for this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.